We are now live, Judith.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Judith Andrako, Regulatory Officer for Site Remediation and Waste Management. We've gone live and we're going to wait about 1 or 2 minutes to make sure that everyone can get on if you're having technical difficulties. So we'll be starting momentarily.
Hi, just checking if you can hear me.
We can, the panelists could hear you, I guess. I'm hearing you.
I hear you as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just having still trouble getting onto the site, even though I know you opened it. And it doesn't sound like, I don't know that anyone else is on. Can you tell, has Kevin Monaco come on?
We can see phone numbers of people who have logged on, but we cannot see who those individuals are.
Yeah, okay. And you may want to, so I see it's *6 to unmute your phone to speak. And is there a way to mute it from there if you wanted to? I don't hear anyone else.
I don't know. Tyrone, Anthony, do you know?
I just muted all of the phone numbers, but I guess the caller unmuted themselves.
Right.
Yeah, there is a way that I can mute all of the phone numbers.
No, not that I want you to. It's, yeah.
Well, we
Okay.
kind of want to mute the phone numbers because we don't just want people speaking during the presentation.
Okay.
All of the Q&A we would like to have typed in. So if you see your Q&A panel and you have any questions, you just ask your questions through that.
Oh, I see. So this is just going to be a presentation, and are you opening it up for any oral comment today?
No.
Okay.
No, the whole idea is to have a recording through the Teams system. And if you could put your comments or questions in the Q&A panel, then we're going to get to as many as we possibly can and then answer the rest at a later date. But that way we'll have a record of the whole thing.
I understand. Okay. And we spoke to Karen, we had spoken about this, that we'll submit some written comments after the presentation.
Right.
Put your comments or questions in the Q&A panel, then we're going to get to as many as we possibly can and then answer the rest at a later date. But that way we'll have a record of the whole thing.
I understand. Okay. And we
So Tyrone and Anthony, we have that feedback loop going.
submit some written comments after the presentation.
Right. Put your comments or questions in the
Hi, Anthony.
Yes.
Can you, I was going to say, can you share and unshare again, but hold on 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
So Tyrone and Anthony, we have that feedback loop going.
I'm about to do something with it. Now, how about now?
I'll talk now and see if it starts again.
What I did was I pretty much just muted everyone, and it seems to kind of have helped.
Okay, I guess that's what we'll have to do. Judy, maybe you make that announcement as well, that we are going to mute everyone to prevent a feedback loop.
Yes.
Okay.
And from you know, people speaking during the presentation and getting any background noise.
All right, I'm seeing 9:39, so I guess we probably should get started.
And I think Anthony or I mean our IT folks can interject anytime if they see any problem.
Okay.
We're just waiting for Judy to say something. You can say directly to everybody. I guess.
Okay. The event is live right now, so all she has to do is you know,
Okay.
she just has to begin. It's live, so I'll mute myself. Okay. Everyone mute themselves, and then we can begin.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we're ready to go. Hopefully all of you out there in cyberspace are able to hear us and see us. Again, good morning. My name is Judith Andrako. I'm the Regulatory Officer for the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program. We have a robust agenda this morning with several topics to discuss. Part of my role is to keep the group on task in terms of adhering to the agenda's time frame so that we can cover each topic sufficiently and end discussion about each one on time. Our overall goal is to go through the entire agenda and end the meeting when we expect it to. The presenter of each topic will have time to present the topic to you, and DEP staff will also have questions to ask you regarding several of the topics. After each section has been presented, we will ask the group if you need to have something clarified or if you have suggestions or concerns related to what was just presented. At times, DEP staff will also have specific questions for your feedback. Following the presentations, we have limited time for questions about what was covered. We will select questions, concerns, and suggestions submitted by webinar participants in the order that those questions and concerns are received, and DEP staff will respond. When you share comments, please state your name and who you represent. If you don't have access through Teams this morning, we know that some of you are appearing by phone. If you would still like to provide comment, we ask that you email us at exemptrecycling@dep.nj.gov. Again, that is exemptrecycling@dep.nj.gov. The DEP's goal is to listen to your input. We expect concerns and problems to be identified and solutions to be suggested. The DEP is taking all of your questions, concerns, and suggestions for our decision-making with this rule as it moves forward. Your participation in this meeting today is extremely valuable to us. Thanks again for being here. Before we get started with the substantive content of today's meeting, I would like to go over a few technical issues. First, we ask that everyone mute themselves, or DEP will be muting everyone to prevent a feedback loop in the audio. We've had some difficulties with that lately, and we found that having everyone muted makes the whole audio system work a little bit better. As you can see on the screen, we'd like to make sure that you keep your Q&A panel open to answer the poll questions. As you can see with the red arrow in the right-hand corner, you would click on the question mark icon, which is depicted by the red arrow located on the right side of your screen. You should also click on the Featured tab in order to see comments and poll questions. These poll questions will be in the form of blue hyperlinks. You will need to click on the blue hyperlink during the presentation and promptly answer the questions posed by the presenter. We'll be giving you time to respond. Please be sure to click the Submit button to ensure that we receive your answers. To ask a question, you'll need to click the My Questions tab, illustrated here by the red arrow. And finally, if you ask a question, you should always return back to the Featured tab to read further comments and answers from the moderator. And with that, I would like to welcome you again to the DEP stakeholders meeting for the recycling exemption discussions. Our first speaker today is going to be Bureau Chief Karen Clue.
Good morning. As Judy stated, I'm Karen Clue, the Chief of Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management. I too would like to welcome you to the DEP stakeholder meeting for select recycling exemptions at NJAC 7:26A-1.4. We sincerely hope you enjoy and benefit from this presentation. Next slide, please. Before we get into the details, here's a brief overview of the different groups that will be involved in these presentations. We have three main interest areas involved, which include the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program Assistant Commissioner's Office, the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, and the Bureau of Solid Waste Compliance and Enforcement. All three have worked hand in hand to bring this presentation here to you all today. Next slide. The goals of the rule amendment are to minimize potential adverse environmental impacts from non-compliance. You will see a theme throughout this presentation that we are proposing generally to limit storage amounts and durations. We are also looking to increase enforceability, and to achieve that goal, we are looking to increase and improve reporting requirements. We are also attempting to ensure better coordination with local and county officials, because it is currently unclear if the appropriate local and county officials received the notification for the exemption. There are 565 municipalities in the state, which all handle paperwork differently. We have had some instances recently where it was made clear after the fact that the operator did not notify the correct local official and did not receive all necessary local or county approvals. We are also considering deleting exemptions that are not necessary or are problematic, combining like activities, and we also have recognized the need for some additional new exemptions. Lastly, the rules sunset December 3rd, 2022, which may seem like the distant future, but rulemaking is a multi-year endeavor. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the rule team. You've already met Judy Andrako, who is the regulatory officer for the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program, and who will act as our facilitator today. You have myself, and other members of my team include Zafar Billa, who is the section chief, Frank Polari, and Rakesh Patel, who are both supervisors in my bureau, Mike Trokia and Alex Sadat, who are engineers and exemption coordinators. From the Bureau of Solid Waste Compliance and Enforcement, we have Tom Farrell, the bureau chief, and Paul Smith, who is a case manager. Lastly, Eleanor Krukowski from the Bureau of Non-Point Pollution Control is here to consult with us on stormwater issues as necessary. Next slide, please. There will be poll questions throughout the presentation that the presenters will read and pause for you to click the link to answer. If you would like to write in comments or have additional questions, please do so using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. So we can get to as many questions as possible. Please make your questions as clear and concise as possible. Next slide, please. So the goals of this meeting are simple. We want to hear from you, the industry experts, and from our local and county partners on how to improve these rules. It is my experience that the final product is often far superior if input is received from individuals with diverse perspectives. We grouped like exemptions together in order to avoid having stakeholders come to multiple meetings and sit through topics that are not relevant to them. So we broke the meetings up according to exemption type. If any exemption or exemptions are related, we group them into the same meeting. Next slide, please. This is today's agenda outline. Some of these items may appear familiar as we have discussed them at prior meetings. The speakers may provide a brief recap if an item was covered during a previous stakeholder meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to follow up on your feedback as we attempt to reshape the rules to the best of our ability so that they are equitable and fair to all parties involved. Through your feedback, we will be able to make the exemptions better than before. We will be covering Exemption 1, which covers both asphalt manufacturing plants and pallet manufacturers and refurbishers. However, we will be focusing today's discussion on the asphalt manufacturing plant part of this exemption. Exemption 7 is about short-term storage of Class B materials, and we will be discussing the possibility of volume and time limits and controls. We will also be discussing Exemption 20, which also covers Class B materials, but for on-site generation through construction and demolition. And we will also be introducing a number of deletions that we are considering deleting from this section of the rules. We are considering deleting number 6, which is tires for artificial reefs, which was discussed at a prior stakeholder meeting. We're also considering deleting number 9, which is receipt, storage, processing, and transfer of non-container plastics. Number 10, which is lane clearing activities. Number 11, which is receipt, storage, processing, and transfer of source separated textiles. Also under consideration for deletion is number 16, which is transportation of universal waste and Class D materials, and number 24, which is receipt and storage of architectural salvage. So each one of these agenda items will be covered in detail by different presenters throughout the morning. Next slide, please. Any pictures or trade names of equipment, companies, or services should not be construed to indicate an endorsement by the DEP. The information within this presentation is slated to facilitate discussions on various existing and potential regulatory mechanisms. No final decisions regarding this information is expressed or implied. Now I'd like to move on to Exemption 1 and introduce our first speaker, who is Mike Trocchia, again a project engineer with the Bureau and exemption facilitator. Mike?
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. I am Mike Trocchia, and I'm here to talk to you all about the ever-enthralling Exemption number 1 today. So please contain your excitement and feel free to butter that popcorn because the show is about to start. Okay, so from the Exemption Agenda number 1 meeting held on February 14th, 2019, hard to believe it was a year and a half ago, we carefully listened to and reviewed your input as it is a critical component of the improvement process. As such, the main matters for discussion were the following. The first issue was how to control the uncontrolled millings piles, which are running rampant across the state. You, the valued stakeholders, had told us that this issue is due to the imbalance between supply and demand. Furthermore, you had told us to explore other avenues to use the millings upon, which can be taken literally and metaphorically. Also, it was advised that the solution opportunities should be environmentally sound, as it could be useful to examine how other states manage their millings, and the volume control may also be preferred over the time limit for easier management methods. So please note that these questions, along with the upcoming Exemption number 7 and 20 questions, were asked with a slightly different group of stakeholders at the time, and thoughts may have changed since then. So to gain more valuable insight, we will ask similar questions with the help of your feedback and narrow them down to ensure we are focusing on your insights and drilling right down to the core issues at hand here. So we may not be able to hear you all right now, but we hear your intentions loud and clear and only want to assist your efforts to the best of our ability. To that end, we want to make clear the following as well. We will venture to craft the regulations to ensure that your efforts will remain beneficial to the corresponding businesses that you all work with. Also, we will make sure that the opportunities allow for high levels of production, cost effectiveness, and proceed with the respective operations unfettered. As long as you are all willing to work with us to control these piles and other issues, we will do whatever it takes to better the regulations to allow the requested changes to occur. We are here to help in any way and every way that we can. Now, let us move on to the next part of your feedback from the prior meeting. So, getting back to the main matters at hand, limitations to get a solid handle on the uncontrolled millings and methods to better manage this exemption itself were discussed. So, a few facilities have accumulated mountains of asphalt-related millings piles with vegetation such as trees growing out of some of them. Needless to say, that is a bit of a troublesome issue and must be dealt with in a timely fashion to prevent further issues from arising. The volume and time limitations may be the best way to get a handle on this, as mentioned before, and the related issues, with the height limitations being subject to fire codes and local regulations. The final matter for discussion is the intermediate storage provision. This has been in our regulations for a long time, but it has never been requested thus far. Our prior presentation discussed that this provision may be useful for certain situations. We will talk about this more so later on to gain more information to properly refine this activity for the future. All right, let's move on to some background information. Next slide, please. Okay, here is a summary of the exemption itself. So the allowed activities include asphalt manufacturing plant's ability to receive and process the following materials: asphalt millings, asphalt shingles, and other asphalt-based roofing scrap material. Additionally, pallet manufacturers or refurbishers are allowed to process non-salvageable wood pallet-related materials that are generated from their manufacturing and refurbishing operations for a period of 1 year. A bit of a mouthful, but it's important. Now, the less ideal part, but we must discuss the limitations. For asphalt manufacturing plants, the asphalt materials shall be delivered directly to the plant from the site of generation, unless intermediate storage is authorized by the DEP. As mentioned prior, the latter request has yet to occur in any shape, form, or capacity thus far. The principal mannerism intended to handle the millings mountains are through the inception and creation of applicable and appropriate limitations in the form of time and volume to tackle these problems effectively. Okay, onward to even more background information. Next slide, please. Let's continue with the basics, shall we? That being said, this exemption is also known as the manufacturer's exemption because it is designed to assist with the smaller recycling operations that are based in manufacturing processes and environments. To date, we have the following records for our exemption applications. We have approximately 10 issued pallet manufacturing exemptions on record, with no major problems having been reported thus far. Let's keep it that way. Also, we have approximately 60 asphalt manufacturing exemptions on record thus far. As mentioned earlier, the mounting piles of asphalt millings are of great concern, which we want to get a handle on to mitigate safety and environmental concerns. Okay, now let's move on to the next exciting chapter in the manufacturer's exemption saga. Next slide, please. As we discussed beforehand, the mountainous piles of asphalt millings across the state of New Jersey are a problem. From the last presentation, we addressed this question prior and received valuable responses to attempt to solve this situation. As the construction business had been booming prior to the pandemic, the piles were anticipated to go down slightly. Luckily, non-essential construction recommenced on May 18th, so this will continue once again and advance the efforts for reducing the piles. Looking once more at that summary, it was made clear that supply does not equal demand here and has led to the gigantic piles being formed that we see today. Furthermore, it was advised that a volume limit would be more useful than a time limit, and it may be more useful as well to examine other states and see how they are handling these kinds of situations. Lastly, it was made clear that ensuring that all of these efforts are conducted in an environmentally sound manner is pivotal to the whole operation. We agree with all of those points and have done our research. To aid the efforts and to supplement our initial questions on this subject, we would like to ask our first main follow-up question set, which will make full use of the Teams polling functionality to ease the question and answer system. As Judy mentioned earlier, the poll questions will appear on the right-hand side once the Q&A chat window has been opened up. Once you click on the link, you will be redirected to a separate screen, which will have all three main questions for this slide within the same window to make things easier. Once you are done answering all three questions, please click the Submit button, and you may then close out of the poll question menu if it does not close automatically. Then, please head back to the presentation window and try not to close it accidentally. It's happened to me a few times, so don't worry about it and don't feel bad. Okay, let's get into the bulk of this and fully divulge the questions at hand here. So, our first question is, how should the department control the uncontrolled millings piles? Should it be A, volume-based, B, time-based, or C, facility production-based? Or D, the type-in functionality through the polling screen? So please answer this question and the ensuing poll questions through the poll question link in the Q&A chat menu as I mentioned before. Please take a minute to answer these questions, and if you don't answer them right away, that is perfectly okay, as the links to these questions will be available for the next 24 hours after this presentation. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So, asphalt millings are brought into the manufacturing process, and we believe that their input may be able to be tied to the hot mix asphalt production rate. With that being said, our next question for you all is, would it be possible to generate reports to allow facilities to create millings storage needs estimates based on hot mix asphalt production rates? Your simplified and suggested answer choices are A, yes, B, no, or C, type in using the polling functionality. Leading off of that subject, our third question overall and final for this slide is, do you foresee any alternative usages for millings? Looking at all of these questions asked thus far, we want those of you affected by this to ponder other potential ideas and means to use this to curb and reduce the giant asphalt millings piles. Our primary concern is the storage of the raw materials, and we want to be able to establish fair and equitable limits based on the asphalt manufacturing plant's capacities, as every plant is different. Lastly, for the come into compliance timeframe, we realize that this is highly operational dependent as each facility is different and unique, and we want to discuss this on an individual basis if it is easier. But does anyone have any other ideas for other uses of millings? We are open to all comments and suggestions here, so do not be afraid to speak your mind verbally through the Q&A functionality screen. If we do not have time for the questions and answers, we will address them later on. Okay, onward to our next storage-based topic. Next slide, please. Following up from where the prior slide left off, we would like to ask the following additional questions to gain more input. So our next question is, should the limits be based on volume or time? For time, what should the throughput capacity limitations be? The choices are a fixed volume, a throughput capacity of a half year to 1 year, a throughput capacity of 1 to 2 years, or a throughput capacity of 2 to 3 years, and of course the type-in option as well. We are doing our absolute best to create these revised regulations with keen attention to your feedback and to make them better for each and everyone involved. Continuing, this ensuing question is concerned with volume this time. So for volume limitations, is it appropriate to impose limitations based on fixed volumes versus equipment capabilities? If so, what would appropriate limitations look like? Your choices are up to 5,000 cubic yards at any given time, up to 10,000 cubic yards at any given time, up to 20,000 cubic yards at any given time, or even all the way up to 30,000 cubic yards at any given time. That's a lot of material. So we endeavor to present as wide a volume range as possible to give you all the opportunities to select an answer that best fits your operational needs. Okay, onward to our next slide. Next slide, please. Now let's go back to another widely discussed topic. So within this exemption, there exists the provision that allows for intermediate storage away from the plant. This request can be granted as long as the desire is properly expressed and circulated to the department and ultimately approved. The problem is no such approval has yet to be requested or issued to date, and no other specific details are included within the regulations behind this matter itself. So our final question for you all is, should the intermediate storage provision be authorized for certain projects? If yes, what kinds of projects would be best for this provision? Your choices are yes for long-term projects, yes for construction-oriented projects, yes for general recycling operations, and no, and there is also the poll filling question as well. So the reason behind the proposed removal of this provision is due to lack of use and general ambiguity. As mentioned prior, it was made clear that this provision may be necessary for certain projects, and we simply wish to gain more feedback on that subject. I realize these questions may be difficult to answer at this time and tedious given the meeting setting, but would anyone be willing to explain or type out a practical example in the comments so we may better understand your thoughts on keeping this provision? And if there is not enough time, you may always contact us via telephone or the DEP exempt email, which is mentioned earlier, or at the end of the slide set, so that we may discuss the question at length to assist with the endeavor in general. That being said, if you have any other questions and have not done so already, please address them in the Q&A functionality toolbar. And so before we move on, that being said, let's take a quick look at your feedback thus far. So Judy, Anthony, or Tyrone, do we have any pressing, relevant exemption number 1 related questions that can be addressed at this time?
Yes, we do, Mike.
Okay.
Are you able to scroll up to Audrey? I'm sorry. I'm going to find Millings questions. Okay, so there's a question from Ryan Rathburn. With limited outlets to utilize millings, are millings piles not preferable to putting them in landfills?
Well, we'd like to avoid that and make use of them for other positive means and reuse them.
Okay, all right. There's a question regarding exemption number 20. It goes from Audrey Winsinger. Exemption number 20 has always worked well on our various projects, but there have been times when we have had a certain volume of recyclable material on a site. We have recycled 100% of it. We have used much of the resulting finished product, but there has been more finished product than we could use on any of our projects in the short term. Can someone speak to the detriment of allowing the sale of a de minimis amount of finished product? Plus, once it becomes finished product, Is it still regulated by the department? Thank you.
So this is Tom Farrell. I'll take that one. We'll be talking about Exemption 20 in the next presentation after the next one, actually. But real quick, we're trying to keep a level playing field with the Class B facilities that are charged very high fees to have that permit. So that was really the thinking about that. But we'll entertain any more back and forth at the end of Exemption 20 presentation.
Okay. I'm sorry. All right. Okay. That's all I have for now.
Okay. And yeah, like Tom said, we'll talk about Exemption 7 and Exemption 20 more so later on, so don't worry, those questions will be answered. Okay, so that is all the time we have for questions right now. So continuing on, we will move on to the ever-exciting Exemption number 7 portion of the presentation. And hang on, as Tom Farrell will take it away. Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Mike. I'll be discussing Exemption 7 and Exemption 20. While the poll questions will be presented to you live, wherein the presentation will be suspended for 30 seconds for each question to give you time to enter them, you may also write in questions using the Q&A function at any time. I and the panel will answer any question that you write in at the conclusion of my presentations as time presents. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're on 15, we're good. I'm sorry, go back to 15, please. So here's an overview of the topics we'll be talking about. Will be temporary versus continuous storage, the methods of storage, storage limitations, considering time and volume, and storage buffers. Next slide, please. So here's an overview and abridgment of the regulations for Exemption 7. I'll just read them quickly. Allowed materials to receive, store, and transfer would be wood, concrete, brick, and block. Not allowed would be processing of any of those materials or receipt of scrap tires, leaves, petroleum contaminated soils, or non-container plastics, which is like plastic sheeting. So you can have limited operations or continuous operations under this exemption. Limited operations operate for a period of up to 60 days. At the end of that 60-day period, all of the materials need to be removed. You can do that twice per year. For the continuous operations, the materials must be stored in roll-off containers or similar vessels. The materials transferred must be transferred to an approved and authorized recycling center. For both temporary and continuous options, you need to keep daily records. You need to record the volume received, the volume transferred, and note the end market you are using. So a couple of notes on this slide. The material should be stored in a manner which prevents runoff, leakage, or seepage from the storage area into or onto the ground surface. That ties into potential stormwater permit issues, so the more you protect your runoff, the better. For the daily records, you need to keep them for 3 years, and you should keep them on site because they are required to be presented to the inspector at the time of inspection. Next slide, please. So here's our first question. I'll give you 30 seconds to answer this. Here it is. Assuming the existing 60-day storage time frame is altered, what should it be changed to? Your choices are A, eliminate, B, remain the same, C, up to 120 days, D, up to 180 days, or you can type in some other option. So I have a little stopwatch here, and I'll give you 30 seconds, and we'll have a little pause while we're waiting. Okay, next slide, please. So if you did not have time to answer that, like Mike said, these links will be available for 24 hours. So you can always go back in the recording and, you know, or the live link and answer it at that time. Okay, so we have 3 questions on this slide. We recognize that appropriate storage depends upon many site-specific factors such as site constraints, sensitive receptors, presence, absence of impermeable surfaces, such that best management practices may be possible with tarps versus containers. However, the question of preventing runoff is important, so we ask these 3 questions. Question 8A, for temporary storage, should containers be required? Your choices are A, yes, B, no, C, other. You can type it in what your answer is. And I'll give you 30 seconds for that. Okay, next slide, please. I'm sorry, we're still on this slide. My bad. Next question. Question 8B, if containers are required for temporary storage, should such containers be required to be covered at the end of each day? Your choices are A, yes, B, no, C, other. You can type in your answer. 30 seconds. Okay, question 8C, should the required containers for sites with continuous storage be required to be covered at the end of each day? Answers A, yes, B, no, C, other. You can type in your answer. 30 seconds. Okay, next slide, please. So the DP has encountered abandoned sites for which the volume is problematic. Despite the requirement to record daily incoming and outgoing volumes, it's been very difficult to discern if such recyclable materials are actually recycled within the 1-year limitation. So we asked this question. We recognize that some of your facilities are constrained, and if that's the case, I would assume, for the purposes of answering this question, a height restriction of 20 feet and a horizontal site buffer of 25 feet. So the question 9 asks, assuming a volume limit is applied, what would a reasonable total volume, and that's processed and unprocessed combined, of materials be? You have choices of A, up to 2,500 cubic yards at any given time, or B, up to 5,000 cubic yards at any given time, or C, up to 7,500 cubic yards at any given time, or D, up to 10,000 cubic yards at any given time, or E, you can type in your answer. I'll give you 30 seconds. Next slide, please. So DP has encountered Class B recyclable materials encroaching on stream banks, utility easements, wetlands, and other sensitive receptors. So we asked this question: should the same 25-foot buffer distance that is currently in action for Class B facilities be imposed upon exempt facilities? Your choices are A, yes, B, no, C, you can type in your answer. 30 seconds. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the conclusion of this next presentation for Exemption 20, I and the panel will entertain questions on Exemption 7 and Exemption 20 as well. So we'll be talking about the contractor's exemption. We have about 100 of these. For the Exemption 7, we had about 120, I believe. So these slides will talk about limitations, about time and volume, processed versus unprocessed materials, and buffers. Next slide, please. So here's a synopsis of the regulations for Exemption 20. Your allowed activities and materials are source separated concrete, asphalt, brick, and block, which you can receive, store, process, and transfer. Your limitations are that you need to be the sole generator of the materials. In other words, you are the contractor that is demolishing the building and taking these materials back to your contractor's yard. They need to be stored and processed at your yard. A completion schedule for processing activity must be provided to DEP, and each processing needs DEP approval, something that we see very little of. The operator should be the sole end user of end products to be utilized for future projects. You have the temporary continuous storage options with Exemption 20. Temporary storage, you can operate up to 60 days. After the 60 days, all materials must be removed, and you can do that twice per year. Or you can do the continuous storage, where you need to store the materials in roll-off containers or other similar containers. Both temporary and continuous storage requires daily records, must be maintained for volume received, volume transferred, and the destination where it went to. Each period of processing shall have a schedule to submit it to the DEP as noted herein, and this is something that we don't see and will be really focusing on as it's necessary. And the daily records, just like with Exemption 7, they need to be available to the inspector upon inspection. So they need to be kept on site for a minimum of 3 years or the duration of your exemption, whichever is longer. All right, so next slide, please. So DP has had issues with abandoned class or Exemption 20 sites holding Class B materials. This has been a problem because of a number of concerns, whether it's encroached on sensitive receptors, whether it's just an eyesore, whether the stormwater runoff is a problem. So we asked this question: what should a time limit for storage be? Answer: A, no time limit. B, up to 120 days. C, up to 180 days. D, up to 1 year. E, other, type in. We'll give you 30 seconds. Next slide, please. So another question about volumes, and again, if you have concerns with your constraints of the footprint of your storage yard, I would assume a maximum height of 20 feet and a horizontal buffer distance around the storage area of 25 foot. So we asked this question. Assuming a volume limit is applied, what would a reasonable total volume of processed and unprocessed materials be? Okay, so they're combined. Your choices are A, up to 2,500 cubic yards at any given time, B, up to 5,000 cubic yards at any given time, C, up to 7,500 cubic yards at any given time, D, up to 10,000 cubic yards at any given time, and E, write in your answer. 30 seconds. Next slide, please. So buffers, as I said, we've had problems with encroachment on sensitive receptors. So question 13 asks, should the same 25-foot buffer distance that is currently in action for Class B facilities be imposed upon exempt facilities? Your answers are A, yes, B, no, or C, type in your answer. 30 seconds. Next slide, please. While the operator will likely separate processed and unprocessed piles for business purposes, rendering a requirement for same route, such requirement is contemplated to be included just so the DP has some indication on the readiness of the material to be removed. So we ask this question. Assuming there is a requirement for a distinction between processed and unprocessed materials, how should a distinction be made? Your choices are A, pile separation signs, B, pile separation barriers such as bin blocks, C, an 8-foot aisle space, D, all three, that would be A, B, or C, or E, other. Type in your answer. 30 seconds. Okay, Tyrone, can you tee up any write-in questions that we had beside the poll questions for exemptions 7 and 20?
Sure. I think Judith is going to ask those questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judith?
Okay, from the Q&A?
Yes.
I just have to go over to that second screen. I'm sorry about that. Question, can the material be stored in a blocked concrete bin block off area with some type of filter fabric for any runoff?
So it's a very specific question. We're not writing these regulations with such specificity at this time, so I can't give you an absolute answer. I can say that there'll likely be someone from the stormwater program giving you input on that. Generally speaking, you know, the more control you can have on runoff, the better. I'm getting some feedback. Okay, so I think I'll just leave it at that. Any other question?
That was the only question that I see. There were a few other comments which we can respond to in time, but those were all the questions for this set. Okay.
So this was the last slide for exemption 20. And I'd like to pass it over to Rakesh Patel, who's a supervisor in the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, to discuss exemption consolidation and elimination. Rakesh?
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rakesh Patel, supervisor in the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management, extending you a warm welcome into my part of the presentation. So far, we discussed the exempt activities that warranted certain changes to the existing rules. Now, what I'm going to focus on is the deletion of 3 exemptions that are obsolete or do not have any relevance with the recycling rules, or in some cases, the activity is already covered under other exemptions or other regulations. So let's take a quick look at each of the 3 exemptions summarized on this slide. Exemption number 6, which allows the recycling of tires for use in the artificial reef projects. So for this exemption, the department any notification for this activity thus far. So the department thinks that the use of whole tires for artificial reef projects can be approved through the beneficial use determination application process. Exemption number 16, which allows the transportation of universal waste and other source separated Class D material by universal waste transporters. For this exemption, as many of you know, vehicles hauling any type of recyclable materials for further recycling does not need to register with NJDEP, as these transporters are required to operate under state and federal transportation agencies' regulations. The next one is exemption number 24, which allows the receipt and storage of architecture salvage. This activity under this exemption does not have any relevance with the recycling rules. Next slide, please. As few of you may know that the department has been conducting an exempt facility outreach campaign to figure out the current status of 1,500 plus exemptions that are currently in existence. As such, here is some of the information we have gathered that you can see it on the slide. Looking at exemption number 6, we have had a total of 0 applications submitted over the course of many decades. As a result, there have been no assessments submitted for this activity. Looking at exemption number 16, we have only 2 on the record and have been able to reach one of them applicants, but we have not received any response. And lastly, for exemption number 24, we again have only 2 on the record and have received no response to date, with the contact information verified. Next slide, please. To summarize these 3 exemptions, we only have 4 notifications compared to total of 24 exemptions that have over 1,500 notifications. So the department firmly believes that the deletion would not impact any of the recycling activities that are covered under these 3 exemptions. Next slide, please. So now let's move on to the Q&A. The question is, if these exemptions are to be deleted, what would be the potential downsides? The choices are A, yes, explain with the type-in features, and the other option is B, none. And you have 30 seconds to answer those questions. Lastly, if anyone has any question, please feel free to ask them through the Q&A section, and the panelists and we will try to answer the question as soon as possible. With that, I thank you again for your attention, and I will now turn it over to Alex, who is going to talk about deletion of other exemptions. Alex.
Thank you, Rakesh. I am Alex Sadat, and I am an engineer with the Bureau of Recycling and Hazardous Waste Management. And I am also an exemption coordinator who handles the management of all exempt recycling facilities in the state. Continuing our exemption deletion discussion, we will now cover the second half of exemptions to be removed from the rule text. All the exemptions we have decided to delete are not. Whoops, I lost my place. Are not otherwise subject to general or limited approval requirements, if not exempted. As you can see, land clearing activity is one such that does not otherwise require a general or limited approval that we could envision. Therefore, we are considering removing it from our rules. The first exemption to be deleted is Exemption 9, which deals with non-container plastics. The second is Exemption 10, which handles land clearing related activities. The third and final is Exemption 11, which deals with the handling of source separated textiles. As reiterated prior, these exemptions are going to be potentially removed due to lack of use, relevancy, and the need to keep recycling as simple as possible. Okay, let's get into more details behind the removals. Next slide, please. So from our rulemaking meetings, we have structured the potential new rules so that the current Exemption 2, recycling of source-separated recyclable materials which are generated, processed, and reused as a product at the point of generation, would effectively absorb the effective main operations of Exemption 10. The new Exemption 2 would allow for on-site recycling of materials that are designated for off-site usage. Therefore, Exemption 2 will have all the main functionalities of Exemption 10 and should solidify the latter's removal. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned by Rakesh, we have been conducting an exempt facility outreach program to figure out the current status of all 1,500 plus exempt recycling facilities that are currently in existence. Based on this assessment, we figured out who was still operating, and it should allow us to improve the exemptions that are subject of the presentation. As such, here's some information. Looking at Exemption 9, we have had 12 total notifications submitted, and out of our 100-200 responses so far, we have received 4 with this exemption, 4 responses with this exemption. 1 responded without filling out the assessment, 2 did not respond, 4 could not be contacted, and one had the activity clearly visible via satellite imagery. Looking at Exemption 10, we have 3 on record and have received 1 complete assessment response and 2 non-responses. Lastly, for Exemption 11, we have 5 on record and have received 3 completed assessment responses. 1 non-response, 1 cannot be reached, and 1 cannot be reached. Now, let's keep going. Next slide, please. To summarize our points, these exemptions have been used on a very low basis. Between the 3 of them, there have only been 20 applied for out of a 24 exemption containing database currently consisting of over 1,500 exemptions. Going forward, the relevant existing activities for these exemptions are intended to be incorporated into other exemptions. In the remaining cases, they're going to be regulated at the local level. These deletions are not intended to harm you in any shape or form, as these activities will still exist through other exemptions or local ordinances. We're trying to simplify and clean up our regulations for all applicable parties to it. Now we move on to the final slide. Next slide, please. As you have seen prior, these questions and answers will be handled through simplified poll type questions to keep the presentation moving along smoothly. These poll questions will be available for 24 hours as mentioned beforehand. As mentioned previously, it should be stressed that by deleting these exemptions, we are not taking away an entity's authority to operate. As long as they have local approvals in place, they are permitted to operate. The 16th overall question, similar to the prior deletion section we have, is if these exemptions are to be deleted, what would be the potential downsides? Your suggested choices are yes, and please feel free to explain via the type in feature. B, no, it will result in no loss of recycling activities. C, please feel free to briefly discuss this matter with us if anyone has any questions or would like to discuss or further opinions. If there are no more questions, then let me thank you again for your attention. I will now turn this over to Karen, who will discuss the matters more related to these exemptions.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I think we have had some questions in the Q&A box that have gone unanswered that would be directed to the individual speakers who just presented. So since we're running a little ahead of schedule, I thought perhaps we could go through those questions and introduce them to read them to the panel for some feedback. Judy, I don't know if this is easier for me to do or if you would like to do it.
Karen, I actually have the Q&A listed up. Okay. I think that there was a question that came in a little bit after Tom's presentation regarding buffers. If Tom wouldn't mind responding to that. It was from Ryan Rathbun, who asked, does the buffer requirement not water down the purpose of the exemption?
Huh. That's an interesting way to phrase the question, Brian. I'm not sure. It's one of the problems with not being in person, that we can have a little bit more back and forth what you're getting at here. I think you're probably getting at an exemption should not be so onerous. It should not have so many restrictions and rules. But an exemption is not an exclusion. An exclusion is we don't even want to hear about it. An exemption is you need to comply with certain rules in order not to have the full permit or recycling approval. So you're going to have some restrictions on an exemption that you would not have on an exclusion. And the 25-foot buffer, when we consider the need for emergency vehicles, the numerous complaints we get from neighbors, we thought that that is probably something that most people would agree with. We'll certainly have some detractors to that, I'm sure. But if you'd like to expand on your question anymore, please just type it in.
Okay, we have another question regarding whether exempt sites are required to obtain approval from a local land use board. And the attendee is wondering, how can they get copies of permits, and who is monitoring or reporting what materials are coming in and going out, and who's supposed to be enforcing the activities?
Wow. Okay, I'll take that. This is Tom Farrell again. I'm the Chief of Solid Waste Compliance and Enforcement. So my staff routinely gets referrals to us on these type of questions. Yes, my staff is responsible to inspect these facilities, and we delegate a lot of that responsibility to the county health departments. So between the county and ourselves, we inspect exempt facilities and try to ensure that they are importing appropriate materials and that they have the requisite approvals in place. I've not seen that question. I can't look at it again. Did I miss any part of that, Judy?
I don't think so.
Okay.
We have another.
I'm sorry. I think that there was a question about who on the municipal level.
Oh, right. So that will be different, depending on the municipality. As Chief Clue said in the opening, we have, 565 some municipalities, and we're not exactly sure how each one of them work. So it's a bit of a challenge. And, I know before these rules are promulgated, we'll probably have to nail that down better to figure out who we should be getting responses from, so that when we have these certifications, we know that they're accurate.
And the rules currently state that the exemption must be in accordance with all local and county ordinances and approvals. So the existing language does not exempt a facility from local and county rules. It has to be in accordance, but we will be making an effort to better coordinate with the towns and counties, so we have confidence that the operator is able to conduct the activity while still being in compliance with local and county ordinances.
Right.
Karen, this is Zafar. I would like to add to that, is that like permitted facilities, the solid waste regulations do not preempt the exempt facilities. The facilities that operate under an exemption are fully subject to all local laws and regulations with regard to siting at least. So the local zoning board and other authorities that the locals have, they can exercise their authority to allow any exempt facilities to operate in their municipality.
Okay, we have another question about Exemption 10 for land clearing. Sites are now cleared by contractors, ground on site, and transferred to a Class B as chips. The person does not believe contractors are getting exemptions. Is that allowed? Or would they need to apply for an exemption under Exemption 2?
This is Zafar again. Can I take this one?
Yeah.
Yes, if any land clearing contractors are currently operating without an exemption and conducting the chipping activities on that site, which is a Class B activity, that requires that exemption number 10. That means they need to notify us before they can conduct the chipping operation and send it to a class B. But in the new revisions of the regulations, we are contemplating or considering to remove that exemption if we can modify exemption number 2. Because currently exemption number 2 only allows on-site recycling of the material that is generated on-site and used on-site. So under the current exemption number 2, they cannot move that chipped material off-site. So if we can revise exemption number 2, only then we can remove exemption number 10, because land clearing activity is not a class B operation. Only the chipping of the wood material is a class B operation. So at that point, once revision of exemption number 2 goes through as we are contemplating, we will remove exemption number 10. There is no need for that.
Now, Zafar, there was a follow-up question regarding exemptions 2 and 10. How would they be applied for tree trimming or removal companies who use smaller trailer grinders?
Well, that's not part of the land clearing activities. That is mostly done by either DOT or the municipalities to maintain their tree lines, and that is not subject to any regulations that I can think of.
Okay, now we have a technological question. Just as a reminder, this great question by Anonymous, how can we access the polls after the webinar is concluded?
If Tyrone or somebody else can respond to that.
Hi, yes, we can, once we have the summary, it's going to take 24 hours for the poll to close. We can provide a summary if you'd like. Thank you.
Right, but will they have access to the poll questions?
Oh, yes, they will have access to the poll questions for 24 hours. I can put together, I have a spreadsheet, but I can provide that in a document with clickable links that they can return to and click those links for the poll questions.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going back around through the list to see if there were additional questions that needed answering. There was a question about whether we would be sharing the poll question results.
Yes, I think we can make those available through the spreadsheet that Tyrone just mentioned.
Okay, I think we're caught up with all of the outstanding questions.
Do you want to give 30 seconds for somebody to ask another question? Maybe they were waiting to hear responses.
Sure, we can do that. And I see that Mike is also typing in some responses to questions that have been asked as additional follow-up, providing additional information too. So Mike, thanks a lot for that.
Okay, so we're just going to give you all 30 seconds in case there's something you want to ask now that you have not had a chance to ask.
And the presentation is not over yet. Karen has to present her on 1.4b and 1.4c. So the attendees will have time to pose additional questions in the meantime.
I am muted, so nobody heard that. So anyway, we're on slide 36. The purpose of this slide is to reconnect with you, the stakeholder. This is a good opportunity, as Zafar just mentioned, to pose any additional questions, but we would like to ask you some additional poll questions that are more general in nature and open-ended. We would like to hear from you if you've had any issues and experiences that you would like to share that are not covered, that were not discussed during today's presentation. That can be answered in question 17A, that yes, you have, and you can type in your experience, or no, you have not. The second part of that question is, does anyone have alternative ideas to improve these exemptions? Again, these can be a yes with a suggestion, or a no that you can't think of anything at this point. And then the last question is just a very open-ended fill-in. Is there anything else that we haven't thought of relative to these specific exemptions that you would like to bring to our attention? Again, these can be answered by clicking on the blue link in the Q&A column on your screen, and we will give you the 30 seconds or so to answer these. Because these are open-ended questions, you may want to go back to these at a later date and within the next 24 hours. Immediately after perhaps the presentation, and provide any insight that you would like to provide. Next slide, please. So record keeping has been a bit of a problem for many of these exemptions from an enforcement standpoint. So that therefore the department is considering requiring record keeper, better and more uniform record keeping. These record keeping initiatives may come in the form of daily logs or electronic record books, trackers, or other means. From this, it is envisioned that the organization, operational management, and enforceability will benefit. So this is an opportunity to enlighten us as far as what kind of record keeping provisions are commercially available. Anything from a low tech daily log to perhaps a electronic record keeping mechanism. If you could provide that input in the Q&A column, that would be appreciated. We did not ask this as a poll question. Next slide, please. Although best management practices are not specifically named here, the theme throughout these changes incorporate how best to manage the materials using practices that are protective of human health and the environment. Therefore, again, we are looking for any kind of input on suggestions on what kind of best management practices can be employed and suggested in the rules. Next slide, please. We are considering changes to the general requirements for all exemptions that are at 1.4b. The department is considering proposing a requirement that will prevent multiple exemptions of certain types for contiguous sites controlled by the same person. We have had some instances where people are combining the exemptions and essentially bypassing the need for a full-blown Class B or C recycling facility approval. We are also considering requiring the operator certify that all necessary federal, state, county, and municipal approvals have been obtained. Again, we have had some examples of where there have been local ordinances and local planning and zoning laws that were not abided by, that resulted in quite controversial operations at exempt facilities, which even led to some litigation. So again, another theme throughout these rule changes is the idea that we have got to do a better job all around, from the state perspective as well as from the operator perspective, in coordinating with local and county officials. We may propose an explicit requirement that the operator receive DEP's acknowledgement prior to commencing operations. Right now, the rule is silent, so some people have began operations upon submitting the notification to the department. That was not the intent, so we plan to try and clarify that by proposing a requirement that says you may begin operations as soon as you receive the department's acknowledgement. We may propose that the exemption expires with the ability to re-notify and renew. We are considering imposing a fee for the initial application and renewal to cover the department's costs for administering and enforcing the program. We recognize that some of these new requirements will be new to existing exempt operators, and so we will be introducing a phase-in process of any of the new requirements for pre-existing exemption operations. Next slide, please. In order to increase transparency, we are considering proposing a requirement for exempt activity operators to post on their website a list of all necessary approvals obtained. In blue, you will see a fictitious example. I'd like to stop here for a poll question. Should the department require the holder of this exemption post on its website all the local and applicable approvals held? Your suggested and simplified response choices are A, yes, B, no, but also feel free to discuss further in the answer. I will pause now for 30 seconds to allow you to click the link in blue in the Q&A panel to consider and answer this question. Next slide, please. Also, with the goal of increasing transparency, we are considering proposing the requirement to post a sign at the property where the exempt activity is taking place. That includes the operator's contact information and number and type of exemption. In blue, you will see an example of a fictitious sign. Again, I'd like to pause here for a poll question. Should the operator of the exempt activity be required to post a sign at the site that is visible to the public? Your suggested and simplified answers are yes, A, B, no, or and also, again, feel free to discuss this further. I will pause for a few seconds here so you can click the link on the blue link in the Q&A panel to answer this poll question. Next slide, please. We are considering changes to the certification requirements in the exempt rules. I will provide a quick overview of the changes that we are considering. We are considering changing the certification language itself to be consistent with other rules in the site remediation and waste management program, like the underground storage tank rules and the administrative requirements for the remediation of contaminated sites. We are thinking of adding to the certification an explicit statement that all applicable municipal, county, state, and federal permits and approvals have been obtained. We will be proposing a clarification in terms of individuals signing the certification. For example, for a corporation, it must be a responsible corporate official, which we further define as President, Secretary, Treasurer, Manager of Manufacturing, Production, and Operating Facilities, given that that manager is authorized to make important management decisions governing facility operations and is permitted to sign the corresponding document. There are similar details in the proposal that we are considering for those who can sign a certification for a limited liability company or for a partnership, a sole proprietorship, and for municipal, county, state, federal, and other public agencies. We further define what a duly authorized representative. Also, we will be proposing that a National Association of Information Destruction certification be maintained for the entire duration of the new mobile shredding exemption being proposed. Please see the Stakeholder website for more details about the mobile shredding exemption that we will be proposing. Next slide, please. So we're winding down here, and we'd like to thank you for your time and your input. Again, it has been my experience that input from diverse perspectives results in a much better finished product. So our last poll question is, how did we do? This is an open-ended question on how we can improve future stakeholder meetings. This was a test case for us in that this is our first virtual stakeholder meeting. We did try and brainstorm methods by which we could somewhat control the conversation, but also allow some back and forth. We realize that it's not ideal and that there are some limitations associated with this technology. So if you could provide some input on other IT solutions for these types of meetings, because I am not sure when the public health emergency will lift to the point where we can have large gatherings such as a stakeholder meeting in person. A recording of this presentation and relevant information will be made available on the DP Stakeholder Work Group webpage at the link listed there, and on the Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste webpage. Following the publication of the proposal in the New Jersey Register, a formal comment period will open and DEP will accept comments by anyone choosing to make them. Please direct your main questions via email to the Exempt Recycling general email box listed here. I'll give you a moment to click on the blue link in the Q&A panel to answer the question on how to improve future stakeholder meetings. Next slide, please. The subject of what we anticipate our last stakeholder meeting to be will be the introduction of possible exemptions for the growing issue of food waste composting. We are considering a number of possible exemptions for food waste composting, including one for micro-scale food waste composting, in vessel or encapsulated food waste composting, and small-scale commercial food waste composting. With that, I would like to again thank everybody for their time and open the floor up to questions that can be addressed to the panel via the Q&A panel. There are 2 additional slides that are references that attribute credit for each image that was used during this presentation. Judy, would you like to see if we have any additional Q&A questions from the audience?
Sure. We have a question whether the department can consider adding an exclusion or exemption for site remediation that provides for LSRP professional judgment and promotes consistency between site remediation rules and guidance and solid waste recycling rules, especially with regard to recycled asphalt pavement.
Sounds like the question stumped the panel. Nobody's jumping at it. That's an interesting concept. I think that's something that warrants discussion at our internal meetings, but we don't have a canned answer for you right now.
And I would think when it comes to the actual exclusions that are within 726A 1.4, those particular recycling exemptions are limited to those that would be exempt from having to get a permit. So it's a very narrowly tailored exemption world within the areas that would be dictated by a permit usually. And to factor in the LSRP issues, that might be something that would have to be taken care of through an exception from the actual 726A chapter. I mean, those are some of my thoughts right off the top. It's something that we can definitely think about.
And to add to that, this question is specific to RAP. And to add to that, we are still struggling to digest the new RAP law and how to implement it. We are still reviewing it through our DAGs, the scope of this law. And also to complicate the matter, we have a new law, which is the Dirty Dirt Law, soil and field recyclable materials. We are still trying to figure out what is the extent of that law and whether it also would cover the RAP. So there are many things at stake here that we have to consider before even considering an exemption for RAP, even if it comes to LSRP.
Okay, I'm going back to the beginning to see if there is anything that was not addressed by either written response or oral response. So please give me a moment. And thank you to my fellow moderators for putting in some written answers to some of the questions in the Q&A. Great job. Okay, we have a question. DEP mentioned it is considering impact of the dirty dirt law on RAP, whether it's covered or not. And this exemption, the question is, would you be providing that information to those participating today and the regulated community?
Yeah, whatever we decide, it will be public. There should be a way to communicate to the regulated community of our decisions in the future. Yes. To add to that, yes, if it's specific to those participating in today's stakeholders meeting, we have a list, and if it impacts this exemption, we can post it on the website.
All right, and going through the Q&A, there are a few other comments that have been posted that aren't specific questions that we will be answering in kind in writing through the Q&A. Does anyone have any additional questions? Okay, I see there was a question that was posted to the chat function earlier this morning, asking, can someone speak to the terminology, quote, once all prior township and other approvals are obtained, end quote. They have experience and inability to make use of the exempt approval process, which is very useful, because townships that they have encountered are either confused on what role they play in the process, or they send a very lengthy site plan approval process. In years past, townships have participated in the approval process through more of a notification and comment, which allowed exemptions to operate as they were intended to maximize recycling, streamlining the process, and keeping the municipality in the loop.
Yeah, as we discussed, the exemption language already requires that all municipal and county ordinances be in compliance, that these rules, as the FAR stated, do not preempt local rules as they do in other instances. So,
well, as a follow-up, apparently most municipalities have no zone in their zoning ordinances that really would allow an exempt C&D recycling operation. So a lot of the inquiries end up going to the land use board.
Okay, so that's what we explained in the beginning, that not all the municipalities work in the same fashion. So we would probably like to figure out which municipalities have zoning boards, which ones do not, but instead goes to the land use board. So those are the information that we would need to gather in due time before this exempt rule revisions finally revisions are made and goes into effect.
Right, and if there is some confusion on the part of the municipality, that is where the better coordination and communication can come in. But our role is generally to receive these notifications to ensure that they are in compliance with local and county rules, because our rules require it, without being overly involved. We monitor these activities as part of the enforcement program that Tom described.
Also, we are considering to revise the rules to for the applicant to include the local approvals or documentation of local approvals along with the notification. So if the local approval involves land use, they have to get it from the land use. If it involves the local zoning, they have to get it from the zoning board. And they have to submit the documentation. If the thought process goes through that, we would require a documentation of local approvals along with the notification.
Okay, and there's another question. Is there any way to tie volume-based pile limits to facility size or production capacity? Basically, instead of using fixed volume limits. There was another person attending who added on to that question, basically stating that the big problems with volume calculations is that measurements are usually incorrect on site.
Right, so we have some new technologies out there with laser focus. It's helping us get more accurate on our volume calculations. A lot of facilities are using drones. The department has some drones which calculates volume. So I'm not as concerned with that going forward, although it's still in development and it's not common. I see it happening more and more. But as far as tying it into the particular facility, that has merit as well, and we'll be discussing that more thoroughly for sure.
Yeah, I think I responded in writing on one of the comments, which is very similar to this one above. And in order to tie it with the production capacity, first of all, we have to find out the production rate of that facility. I'm talking about the asphalt manufacturing plants. And what percentage of raw material is introduced as asphalt millings. And from that, we have to calculate the per batch amount of asphalt millings introduced and multiply that by the number of batches that is produced in a year. And then we have to figure out how many years worth of asphalt millings we would allow them to store on site. So there is a way to calculate that. This is just a simplification of that thought.
Yeah, and of course the problem side of that is supply and demand. What's the market doing? So there's all kind of concerns to consider.
Right, and the supply and demand does not affect the maximum production capacity of the equipment that they have installed at the site. So probably we will calculate based on the maximum throughput capacity. We cannot solve all the problems, but yeah, that's the way probably we can limit the volume.
Okay, we have another question. Will you be going over the Class B wood in more detail in the future?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, we would like to like Wayne to be more specific about the problems associated with wood.
Okay, and Mike, thank you for your written answer to that. I'm just going to state it in case some haven't caught up. This was covered in a prior stakeholder meeting, and our next stakeholder meeting is planned to be for food waste. If there exists a need to revisit this issue, we can discuss it again. To to that end, Mike has actually posed the question to the attendees. Would anyone like to revisit the exempt Class B wood-related sites again?
So, Wayne, if you can hear us out there, can you give us a little bit more specifics behind your question? What particularly are you interested in hearing about?
And then just as a friendly reminder, we're always open for additional comments through the exempt recycling at dep.nj.gov.
Hey, Tyrone, does the Q&A function show when someone's typing?
Sorry, I was muted. They come into the new box and we move them over to the published box. So I think there's a new one that just came in.
Okay.
Okay.
In fact, we just had another comment come in. Perhaps we open up this audience to include mayors and administrators, because a lot of towns do operate differently between zoning and planning boards. And the more information sharing, the better a process can be.
Yeah, I like that.
So even if we reach a point where we have exemption information to be discussed through stakeholdering, maybe have specific give and take stakeholder meetings with township and borough administrators and mayors, basically involving more of the local officials.
Right.
Yeah, we have the ability to reach out to mayors and administrators, I believe, via our Office of Local Government Assistance. So perhaps we could send them some kind of survey of their awareness and how they manage these types of notifications, and that could help inform the rulemaking.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going on 11:25 a.m. I don't see any new or outstanding questions at this point. I'm going to defer to my colleagues to see how much longer we want to leave the lines open.
Tyrone, if somebody, I understand the poll questions stay open for 24 hours. If somebody wanted to enter a comment or question in the Q&A panel, would that also be available for the next 24 hours?
Not the Q&A panel. Once we end the event, that will end the opportunity for them to enter their responses in the Q&A panel. So I can include the DEP mailbox as a link again that Judith just mentioned a moment ago. I can include that box in the responses. I can make an announcement.
Yeah, so that is the best way after this meeting ends to communicate general or specific comments about this rulemaking effort with the rule team.
Okay.
And again, that is exempt recycling at dep.nj.gov.
Exempt recycling is one word, right?
One word, all lowercase.
All right, I guess we can again thank everybody for their time and their participation, and we will be posting this full presentation as well as the agenda and on the DEP's stakeholder work group website as well as the division's website. We look forward to working with you in the future to improve and refine the rule amendments. Everybody stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.